online sync, we did talk about the beginning or the definition of history. Its approaches, the people who have given their definitions on what history is, and the theories behind historic history, and its historical research. You're able to receive also the copy of my PPT for you to study. So that'll be good, for that sa discussion. What we had last time, we talked about the cyclical, for the theories, but the cyclical view of history, the linear view of history. We also have the economic view of history, the greatest man view of history, God's view of history, so on and so forth. Okay, so those are the leanings on how history came about and what were the theories behind it. Okay, I also discussed that history just came a little late, with regards to the acceptance in social sciences as a field or discipline. It's because history was long tagged as part ng literature. It does not have too much on a scientific basis. First included as a science, but later on the 18th to 19th century, history has become part of social sciences because it included now scientific processes, especially when we talk about historical research, it involves now on experimentation, on analyzing the data, so it involves qualitative and quantitative researches. That is why it's very important for us to understand that evidences complements to our claim. Meaning to say, we cannot just claim that something had happened if we don't provide its proof. And those acquired evidences are proof of your claim. But even though you have that kind of evidence, still you needed to undergo process to prove that also your evidence is an authentic and verifiable evidence to support your claim. Okay? And that is why it is bridging to our discussion now, which talks about sources of history. It's part of discussion ng sources of history. We have to understand that there are plenty of evidences coming from personal experiences of those who have witnessed an event and those who have write the particular event based on their research, based on their thorough observations. They have written ample amount of information that created historical facts. Okay, and even a collection of these historical facts as part of tertiary sources became part of many information or sources that we can learn from in order for us to understand the value of history. It's like what I said before, history is not everything that happened in the past. It's very selective. It's because what we put in the context of history are those important matters only that affects the present situation and could lead to solving problems in the future. Okay? So without further ado, let me share my screen and let's watch a video on the topic today before we proceed to our discussion. Nag-load pa, supposed to see a video from YouTube on this one. Primary and secondary sources of history explained. Let me just maximize the screen. Sige, nakita ninyo akong i-present karon?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Please while you play and let me know if madungog ninyo ang audio, okay? Okay, so let's watch now the film. It's still hanging in my end. I hope wala siya nag-hang sa inyo.
Historical sources are central to your study of the past and are important to your success in history assessment pieces. Therefore, it is crucial that you understand what historical sources are and the various kinds and types they exist in. So what is a historical source? A source is something that provides you with information about the historical topic you are studying. They can either be written, like books or websites, or non-written, like photographs or artifacts. No matter what you're doing in history, you'll use sources in order to find out information from the past. This could mean simply reading a textbook or a website, or attempting to interpret ancient artifacts. Either way, these documents and artifacts provide information that is useful to your historical studies and are therefore considered sources. There are two kinds of sources, primary and secondary. The main difference between a primary and a secondary source is when they were made. In order to determine whether a particular source is a primary or secondary source, you need to determine its time of creation. If a source was made during the historical period you're studying, it is considered a primary source. If the source was made after the time period you're studying, it is considered a secondary source. So what are primary sources? As stated, primary sources are sources of information that were made during the historical period that you are studying. For example, if you're studying World War I, any document created at the time of the war would be considered a primary source. Alternatively, a primary source is a document that was made by someone who lived through the events they describe, even if they wrote down what they saw several years later. For example, someone could have lived through World War I as a teenager, but only wrote down their experiences decades later. As a result, their writing is still considered a primary source about World War I. Often, primary sources are the most difficult to find, but as a result, are often the strongest evidence you can use in your assessment pieces. There are some common types of primary sources that you will be looking at. The most common are published documents. These are written sources that were intentionally published to be read by other people. Examples of published documents include books, magazines, newspapers, government documents, advertisements, maps, posters, and legal documents. When reading published documents, please remember that just because they are published does not necessarily make them accurate or reliable. Another type of primary source is an unpublished document. Unpublished documents are also mainly written sources, but were not originally intended to be read by a wide audience, and were typically only meant for the personal use of the author. Examples of unpublished personal documents include letters, diaries, and school report cards. Unlike published documents, unpublished records may be difficult to find because few copies exist. Please be aware that in some cases, unpublished documents can be collected and eventually published, but always keep in mind that they were not originally intended for public consumption. The third type of primary source are visual documents. These are sources that are predominantly images and words. Such examples of visual documents include photographs, films, paintings, cartoons, and posters. Since visual documents contain more images than words, they require careful interpretation to work out what message they are trying to convey. The final type of primary source are artifacts. Artifacts are man-made objects that are usually uncovered by archaeologists. Examples of artifacts are pottery, furniture, clothing, buildings, and other physical items from the past. Like visual documents, because there is no writing on artifacts, they require careful interpretation to be used as evidence in your arguments. Usually you can use artifacts to corroborate or contradict what your written sources say about the past. In contrast to primary sources, secondary sources are documents that were made after the time period you were studying and were created by people who didn't personally experience the events they describe. For example, if you were reading a history textbook about World War I by an author who didn't live through the war, it would be considered a secondary source. Since secondary sources can basically be written by anyone since the time of the events, you'll find that some secondary sources are better than others. Typically, you should only use secondary sources that are written by qualified historians, such as academics, as they are usually more reliable. Like primary sources, secondary sources come in different types. The most common type of secondary sources are books. Books such as school textbooks often have a lot of information about a particular historical period. Another common type of secondary source are academic journal articles. Academic articles are documents that are written by university academics that are published in academic journals for other university academics to read. Since academic journal articles are the result of many years of research by specialists in particular areas of history, they are some of the highest quality secondary sources you can use. However, please be aware that academic journals are written for an academic audience, so the language can be very difficult to read at first. A third kind of secondary source are websites. There are countless numbers of websites that discuss historical events and people. As a result, different websites vary widely in accuracy, reliability, and relevance. However, very few of them are created by qualified historians or experts in their fields. Therefore, be critical of the websites you find through a basic Google search, as most are not of sufficient quality for your essays. If you choose to use websites as secondary sources, make sure you only choose them from respectable individuals or institutions such as universities, museums, or government archives. So now that you know what primary and secondary sources are and what types they exist in, let's look at some examples to solidify your learning. The example sources we'll be looking at will be providing information about the ancient Roman city of Pompeii in Italy, which was buried as a result of an eruption from Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. The first source is by a Roman author called Pliny the Younger, who wrote a letter about the events to his friend Tacitus. In the letter, he says that one day, between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, a cloud of unusual size and appearance was rising from Vesuvius. I can best describe its shape by likening it to a pine tree. It rose into the sky on a very long trunk from which spread some branches. Ash was falling, bits of pumice and rocks that were blackened and burned and shattered by the fire. The buildings were being rocked by a series of strong tremors and appeared to have come loose from their foundations and to be sliding this way and that. Now, even though Pliny wrote this letter many years after the events occurred, he was still an eyewitness of the eruption. Therefore, he is considered a primary source of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. Our second example is also a Roman author called Cassius Dio, who wrote a history book about ancient Rome in which he mentioned the eruption. He describes the events as follows. A great fire suddenly flared up at the very end of the summer. Mount Vesuvius had inexhaustible fountains of fire. Then came sudden violent earthquakes. First, huge stones flew up as high as the mountaintop. Then came a great quantity of fire and endless smoke. All the while, an inconceivable quantity of ash was being blown out. It buried 2 entire cities, Herculaneum and Pompeii. Now, Cassius Dio wasn't born until AD 155 and didn't write his historical account until over 100 years after the events took place. Therefore, he is considered a secondary source of the events he describes. Our third and final source are the archaeological remains of the city of Pompeii itself, an entire Roman city buried in meters of ash and pumice. The remains of countless earthquake-damaged buildings and entombed human remains all corroborate the information provided by Pliny and Cassius Dio. The physical remains of Pompeii date from the time of the eruption in AD 79, so they are also considered primary sources. Now you have a better understanding of primary and secondary sources and the different types that can be sorted into. I hope that you feel more confident in your studies. If you need further explanations, examples, and advice, head over to historyskills.com, and I'll see you next time.
Okay. So that was an important information about how we should be looking history into the account of the sources. Before I begin presenting you the module and discuss it, can somebody please give me probably your input from what you have seen just now? So may makashare kung sa may inyong mga inputs or ideas taken from the video. Anybody from the group would like to share? Or you can also put your answers in our chat box if you are shy in taking the floor of our oral recitation. Sige, wala yung volunteer. I'd like to share your... yes, Apollo. Go ahead.
Kwan, sir. Katong sa unpublished documents, sir, makatag lang kong example. Pwede, sir?
Yes, go ahead.
One example, guys, is katong mga letters sa mga royal family. For example, katong mga letters ng mga royals ng England. Dili to siya gina-publish unless with consent sa katong mga royal family mismo. For example mo, send si Queen Elizabeth kang letter kang George Kuan sa President ng United States. Ang content sa to na letter, dili to ikuan publish kay classified na siya as kuan pa ni state secrets usually nga naman kuan. Another thing is kuan mga transactions sa government nato between or mga deals between government to government unless kuan na ingon pa na ay kuan ang unless dili harmful sa duha ka governments dili na siya usually gina publicize kay tungod na balo na uban na nasod i-take advantage sa nila. Another is intelligence reports during sa war tapos casualties panagsa. Casualties, yung mga patay sa mga tao or wounded during sa war, panagsa dili na gina-publish. For example, atong sa Dresde, dili na publish kay tungod down ang moral sa public, mawala ang war support. So walaon na nila. Atong sa pag-invade mga Hapon diriya sa Pilipinas, gi-downplay ng United States ang actual na numbers ng kano na patay dito. Kaya otherwise, ma-down nila kuan public moral, dili na sila ka-continue sa war. Maura to, sir.
Okay, correct, no? Though unpublished, they are still referred to as primary sources because these documents represents, no, an actual, probably if these are letters, no, an actual participation of a person who is on that particular event, or if these are correspondence, no, katong gisulti about reports ng war, the person who is writing the correspondence is a person who actually witnessed an event. So these are considered as primary sources. No? So there are quite a categories ng primary sources, di ba? The person who is who has witnessed an actual event, no? Atong gisulti nato ng mga unpublished materials, gisulti nato ng mga published materials, and even mga artifacts that gives us an ample amount of information on what happened on the past. On the other hand, secondary sources, technically, these are information taken after the event that happened. So the person documenting it, kanang mga historian na document na niya, was not witnessed a particular event, but just saw information, no? Or probably recovered an information coming from somebody else, then secondary source na siya. But more to that, because I'm going to present to you, your module, and then we have to discuss about that. Okay? Especially, we're going to talk about its importance. Why? We have to look to the sources of history. No, ako siyang balik-balikon sa inyo ha. It is very important for you to look into the details on a particular information shared to you online. Okay? Just like what I said, especially secondary sources kasagaran na ito mabasa online. No? So not everything that we are reading in social media is actually accurate. No? You have to verify its legitimacy. Most of the time, ang mga accurate na mga sources, mga secondary sources are books, di ba? Which we can find in libraries or in schools or in any government or public archives where we can read it. No? And you can see that this was published in legitimate publishing house. This was also created or written by renowned authors who are part on the academic world. So dili lang tungod kay natay nabasa correct and accurate na siya, no? You have to scrutinize properly, especially its publication, the author, unsa may information inside it, if it's accurate ba. Pag gusto din accurate, dapat mo tan-aw ta og mo cross-reference ta, no, sa lain nga mga books, just to see and criticize what are the correct information attained on that particular information and what are those that needed to be checked because they are contradicting to one another. Mabitaw nang when we write, di ba, nagsulat ng research katong sa senior high mo, we have related literature and related studies. This is because we have to support our claim. Because we wanted to test a hypothesis, no? If we are doing quantitative na research. So, pag i-test na itong hypothesis, dili ta mo based on some footing or some ground. So, kinahanglan, suportaan nato na siya from the existing literature and studies na nag-una sa atoa, which can support our claim. Now, aside from studies and literature, napagid tayo theory, no? Because tanan na buhaton sa atuang quantitative research should be grounded on theory. Anyways, let me present to you, our discussion ang Module 2, which is ang sources ng history. So next week, nabatay ko, schedule ng online sync next week or asynchronous mo. Kaya check na lang, nakalimot mo to schedule. Kaya nana ko sa PNU, ana, and the possibility na basing muhin na yung internet, lisod ko connect. So I might be thinking of something na pwede gihapon ta maka-connect, no, with regards to discussion. But anyways, sunod na ako na problemahon kung wala gi saktong connection sa internet. Okay? So this is module 2. Of course, no, our discussion is all about sources of history. So we have to talk about distinction of primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, which you already have an idea based from the video that you seen a while ago. No? Of course, other than the secondary and the primary sources, we also need to discuss about a little bit of tertiary sources. Next, we have to talk about external and internal criticism. No, not because they're being presented with primary and secondary and even tertiary sources, enough na siya to prove, no, that our claim is correct. We still need to go through certain processes, especially scientifically done. No? Next, we have to talk about the text, the context, and the subtext. All right? So, let me go over and... Okay, so now, sources of history, this is very important, no, in the study of history. They are originators of information and data. Abbott, no, places sources with documents, written materials that says something about historical events. Documents can be letters, receipts, copies of speech, eyewitness accounts, narrations, or books. These are some of the sources and are not the only sources of history. Okay, not the only, because there are still an ample amount of sources that we can get. We just have to classify it, whether it falls to primary, secondary, or even tertiary sources. Now, there are some sources which are not written, such as relics, no? Kanitang mga archaeological finds na to, mga fossils, remains, and memorabilia. No? Some sources are alive, such as living eyewitnesses. So when the researcher uses them in his or her research, no, they are always known as respondents or informants. In the study of Philippine history, sources are called batis, which also means stream of spring. No, you are familiar with batis, di ba? A batis, therefore, is a spring of historical information. The usual batis are documents, especially archival documents. So, spring of information. Now, let's talk about the types of sources. No, of course, we have the primary source. It's the lifeblood of history. Again, it's the most essential evidence that we can provide and showcase to the world, no, in order to prove the claim that this event had happened in the past. Without this, then we rely on the secondary sources. But there are quite debates on the secondary sources, especially that the author does not hold an actual evidence. No, if iyara na siya nadunggan, though this comes from a valid oral tradition or history ng isang community, but still it would be nice to support it with tangible materials that can be presented. But we are not taking out the idea of oral history because it is accepted, no? Because ang mga Pilipino, dugay kayo ta, no, ni-adapt into writing format. No, we always have our way of passing down a generational information to the very present. No? Mahilig kayo tag oral tradition. So dili na to ginasulat, but instead atong ginasulti. Ang hazard lang ng oral tradition, if this is not transcribed now in our time, then eventually it may perish. Diba? We have quite a lot of communities, no, na hinay-hinay, especially ang ating mga indigenous peoples, no? Hinay-hinay ng community and their rich culture and tradition and history is has been eroding, no? Slowly. It's because there is now few practices from the community on how to preserve this information. When I say few practices, the next generation or the present generation is no longer participating to the tradition that they know of from time immemorial. no? Kasagaran sa ilaha, they don't engage na in sa tawag na to, apprenticeship, di ba? Sa unang panahon, ang form of education sa ating early Filipinos is apprenticeship. No? Mas uban sa silang papa or silang mama in order for them to learn. Right now, because of the advent of formal education, and since ang formal education does not really provide a big chunk of what that community has shared from time immemorial, and what is being included in the curriculum ng DepEd, ng higher education, is not something very specific to the particular community you belong to. So naananda yun siya ay pag-aagawan ng ideas ba, no? And eventually, globalization, no, took a big part on why practices, no, ng mga indigenous peoples na are slowly eroding. It's because people from that particular group, cultural group is no longer practicing it. So hinay-hinay ang mga katigulangan na lang, di ba? If you're familiar with Apu Wangud, may gani kay napasa niya sa iyang mga pag-umangkon. But definitely, yung mga pag-umangkon is not interested anymore because they could not see a brighter future on, probably, no, a brighter future on following the footsteps of their great aunt, kay very limited ramod kayo na siya sa ilaha lang gid, no? And then, of course, they wanted to have a brighter future, no? Probably seeking for greener pasture. So, kadto nang nisikat si Apu Wangud, dito na po hinay-hinay na adapt nila because nahimo namang tourism attraction, no? Ang ilahang area. But prior to that, they're very secular, no? Sila-sila lang yun. And they have maintained that rich tradition. Though it maintained, pero hinay-hinay, no? It's being eroded tungod kay kasagaran tao dito sila, manglangyaw, para makita og sakto nga trabaho, no? So these are things na dapat i-consider ng government po nato to address problems with oral tradition. Tungod kay kung dili na siya mapasa lagi, no? Mawala gini siya eventually. So sa Mindanao, sa Agusan del Sur in particular, no? Professors from PNU and I think other po ng mga universities within Agusan del Sur and Norte are trying to preserve what can be preserved from the rich culture ng mga Agusanon. So if you take a look to PNU's archives or in the libraries, you will see their collection of poems, no, coming from the Manobo tribe, short stories, songs. So these are being also presented sa NCCE. I don't know if NCCE ba, NCCA. Sa national, nakalimutan ko sa meaning, no? Basta kay kana siya. Alright? So na-present na together with Dr. Nunez sa una, nga nanakaroon sa PRC, no? Ang iyaha is songs to ng Manobo tribe. So a collection of songs that was a product of his research, no? And then yaring gibuhatan og libro to compile these songs. And ang nakanindot mong sa songs as part of oral tradition, okay, mo ginagisulat sa una, it reflects the way of life ng ating mga members ng IP. So meaning to say, diha na ito makitaan how they have preserved their communal ideologies, no, within their own group. So nindot tayo siya. Okay, now the examples of primary sources are minutes of meeting, diaries, journals, autobiographies, speeches, receipts, essays written by person expressing his views, laws, letters of instruction, decrees, letters, eyewitnesses accounts, official reports, newsletter articles reporting directly about the event, editorials or books containing direct quotation and events. All right, so these are some of the examples, no, ng primary sources. Now, a primary source is a first-hand contemporary account of an event or topic. They are the most direct evidence of a time or event because they were created by people or things that were there at the time of event. These sources have not been modified by interpretation and offer original thought of new information. So primary sources are original materials regardless of format. This is very important to note, no? That when an original source, the primary source, is being twitched because it needed to be aligned to the perception of that author, no, ng secondary source na nagsulat, then it could cause problem to what is being presented as it is as truthful, as natural as possible, no? Say, for example, you have seen there a jar, no, containing the remains of our ancient Filipino relatives or Filipino early Filipinos, no? And then that particular practice is a practice ng um, kamatayan. I mean, practice na, on how the Filipinos practice death, no? Of course, we have evidences na mag-support na. However, if ikaw ang author and you don't seem to agree with what the generation, no, generation of this group of people has to offer, imo siyang bagong dili mo guna mo, imong i-impose mo kaugalingon, then that is very hazardous, no? Present what is being presented as natural, as it was, no, from the time nag-practice na until karon, so that we can avoid revisionism. Okay? Okay, so other kinds of primary sources, we have human fossil, artifacts, royal decrees and laws, official reports, chronicles, friar accounts, maps, memoirs, personal account, newspaper, magazines, legislative journals, court records, speeches, personal letters, online databases, blogs, documentary films, recorded interviews. Now, secondary sources are documents of works by individuals who are not directly involved with the events or made by people who obtain the information from somebody else or from primary sources. Examples of secondary sources are textbooks, encyclopedia entries, newspaper accounts of a meeting, magazine articles about the subject of teachers, reports on student behavior as reported by school counselors. There is also third classification of sources called general references. A general reference merely points the reader to the primary or secondary sources. At some point, the general reference is not totally part ng secondary sources. Sometimes sila may separate into tertiary sources, a collection of primary and secondary sources compiled to one bind, no? Sometimes mga encyclopedia, no? Pwede na siya maklasify yan, although at some point, secondary sources would include encyclopedia. Basta these are collection of all the informations coming from secondary and primary sources, tagged along as tertiary source. Now, secondary sources are accounts written after the fact with the benefit of hindsight. They are interpretations and evaluations of primary sources. Remember what I said, na pag i-twitch nimo ang information that you have seen from the primary source could cause a problem. So, man dapat natay careful interpretation and evaluation where science can come in. In order for us to test the validity of our claim, no, we needed to follow protocols from science. Muna sa historical research, it applies scientific analysis, no, by gathering the data from that particular evidence. And that is the only way where we can substantiate, no, the ideas coming from a secondary source. Without proper and crucial scrutiny, no, ng historian to the primary source presented to him or her, then us, the readers, no, might have problems, or if we are very keen, no, that we can see problems along the way on how the event was written. No? So dapat very critical gid ta magbasa mo nang mo cross reference ta. Dili ta diretso musulti nga mo ni siya ang tama, no? It's because it needed to have an ample na mga references or supporting documents, just like other literatures and studies, no? Ingana siya ka importante. So a tertiary source presents summaries or condensed version of materials. Usually with reference back from primary and secondary sources. So, manang gisulti ganiha, no? Almanacs, abstracts, dictionaries, encyclopedias, and handbooks are considered to be as tertiary. Some repositories, meaning to say, asa na ito gipangbutang atong mga sources, no? To provide the general public an evidence that this piece of information in the past is correct, nahitabo siya without alternation, no? So we have the National Archives of the Philippines, National Libraries of the Philippines, National Historical Commission of the Philippines, National Museum of the Philippines, UP Main Library, ADMU Rizal Library, DLSU, UST, Library of Congress, National Archives and Records Administration, Archivo General de Indias, Archivo General de la Nación, American Historical Collection, Lopez Memorial Museum, and Ayala Museum. No? So these are some of the repositories where we can look for the actual piece of information, whether it's primary or secondary or even tertiary. So these are some of the most treasured na mga places where we can look for our history. Okay? So nakuha ba ang differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary source? Or na yung mga pangutan? Okay, before I proceed to external and internal criticism, let me just read pala some of the answers ng mga classmates ninyo when I asked what you have learned so far, no, from the video presented. So from Go, primary sources are the most credible source in terms of information because they are the most direct evidence or witness of an event. Correct. They are present. Well, secondary source or sources are made by individuals obtaining information from primary sources. That is right. Sorry, no. Let me just go over and read these answers. So we have from Martelino, primary sources refer to the documents, physical objects, and oral video accounts made by an individual or a group present at the time and place being described. These materials provide facts from people who actually witnessed the event. No? Correct. Secondary source, on the other hand, are materials made by the people long after the events being described had taken place. That is right. So we have from Manzanas, primary sources are those documents, images, and artifacts that provide first-hand testimony or direct evidence concerning on historical topic under research investigation. From Falcan Santos, primary sources allow the researcher to come as near to what truly happened during a historical event or time period as possible. A text that evaluates or analyzes historical event or phenomena is referred to as a secondary source. It is usually one step away from the event, and it is frequently based on the sources. Yes. Secondary, according to her again, no, sources were created by someone who did not experience firsthand or participate in the events or conditions you are researching. From Kabilin, primary and secondary sources are the lifeblood of historical study. Primary sources are the raw materials of history, original document, and objects which were created at the time under study. They are different from secondary sources accounts or interpretations of events created by someone without first-hand experience. Correct kasi, yeah? So dinala ko basahon because almost all of these answers are accurate from what we just witnessed from the video or seen from the video and also from the discussion I made. Right? Now moving on, let's talk about the external and internal criticism. So not just because we are being presented of the primary, secondary, and even tertiary sources, we can just justify now that these are correct. We are close, but needed to have another thorough investigation. By doing so, we have to analyze it internally and externally. So historical sources exist independent of the research study since they were not written or developed for use of research. Thus, while they serve their purpose well for which they are created, they may not solely serve the research's purpose. Correct, no? Not because we're being presented to an artifact. Say, for example, nakakuha ka of human remains, no? That does not necessarily mean on what happened to that particular event. Say, for example, on the presentation earlier, about Herculean and Pompeii, after Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried, the cities of Pompeii and Herculean and almost all of the citizens there. That doesn't mean imo na siyang nahukay that proves something to an event. You still need to have your internal or external criticism. You need to have an ample amount of data or research, How do we do that? Of course, they do science for that. Check on the carbon footprint of that particular nga artifact, or kung human remains sa siya tanaw, no? Kung accurate ba na kani nga tao namatay tungod kay nibuto ang volcano, natabunan sila, and namatay siya because of that reason. Now, if it is true, try to check the date of that particular na kalansay. If it is the same as what the date was claimed by Pliny, then we can there conclude. Pero dili ra man na mauusa ang imong sabihan, daghan pa man, no? But it's how historical researchers do internal and even external criticism. All right? Now, all sources of historical data must be subjected to rigorous scientific analysis. Mano siyang isulti, no? Rigorous. To determine both their authenticity and their accuracy. Furthermore, historical data are subjected to rigorous scientific analysis through external and internal criticism. Mano ang isulti? Because there might be plots, no? As much as you want to elicit the correctness and truthfulness of that particular event, you may be having problems of the evidences because probably you are on the site, but you can't deny the fact that for all those times no, na nilabay, there may be another object there that causes confusion to the existence of the event you are referring to. Butang na to, nagbutang dito, naglubong dito. No? After 100 years nga natabunan ang Pompeii o ang Herculean City, ang mga tao ni balik probably, then nanapoy civilization na exist, I mean, city na exist, and then nanapoy mga tao nga namatay, naglubong sila dito, no? And it did not have the same qualities from what you are looking to. So mo lang, it needs rigorous na scientific analysis. That's the only way where we can find truth and accurate na information from what we are claiming that happened in the past. Okay? Now, external criticism is the establishment of authenticity. Its purpose is to ensure that the documents are not more forgeries or inventions. So again, take the term forgeries or inventions, no? Many, I forgot lang yun sa itong piece of art, no? Nagibutang sa French Museum, letting the public see nga kadto siya is authentic na material na painting, but instead it was just a replica, no? Kay ang tinuod nga painting wala na diha, I think was stolen, no? Pero na-retrieve ra siya, and people were very kanang astonished na nakita sa itong nga material pero di siya tinuod. So importante kayo that we need to do external criticism to the evidence. Dili tungod kay mura siya og daan nga papel, ato na lang po siyang associate dayon na kani siya nga papel no gikan pag sa World War II nga papel. No, you needed to have another test for that, chemical test to be exact, no, just to see the accuracy of that paper. Kung sakto ba gyud nga sa World War na siya gikan, no? Para sa mga message in the battle, no, daghan kay ng mga nag-exist tapos fabricated forged siya or gibuhat-buhat. No? So let us be very careful. Now, if the researcher is dealing with a problem for which source are relatively old and for which authenticity is not necessarily given, there are a number of scientific techniques available, such as physical and chemical tests, just like I said. No? Now, on the other hand, external criticism it is the establishment of accuracy. No? We do have now correct information because we conducted scientific or chemical tests or physical and chemical tests to that particular document or artifact. Now we need to do internal criticism just to make sure that what is being presented as true physically is also accurate internally. No? Its purpose is to evaluate the accuracy and the worth of that data. In determining the accuracy of that data, 4 factors are to be considered: author's knowledge and competence. So, muna ang gisulti, when we are being presented with an information or data coming from social media, especially that we are into social media in today's age, then we have to check the author. Kani ba nga author nagikan ba sa academic world or basing author lang ni coming from kanang TikTok University? No? time delay. When we talk about time delay, kanus amang gid ni siya na publish was the information includes a particular date and time, no? O ang iyahang gap from what is being referred to as an old na information, no? So you have to consider that one. Next is motives and biases of the author. This is very rigorous as well, no? Because you needed to read properly, check the author's other na mga publications so that you can see, no, its objectivity. Okay? How do you know na bias ang author? You have to read other books nga gikan sa iyaha kay para ma-compare nimo ba. Be, basing kanira ko dayong gisulat nga nay bias because taga diri man gud siya, taga bayugan mo gud siya. Na mo nang gina-highlight niya permanente ang mga maayo sa bayugan. So on and so forth. No? Mas may motives niya ang kaniman ang iyang gisulat. Kung dili ka mo cross-reference sa iyang mga ipang-publish na book, then you may not know. Ay, sakto dahil ganong history permanente sa World War ang iyang gusto. It's because mo iyang expertise. No? Nag-study siya ani-ani ana. Right? And last one, consistency of the data. No? Especially if these are research na mga materials, you have to take a look on the data. If sakto ba ang statistical treatment yung gamit, or sakto ba ang interpretation ng buhat niya if it's qualitative na research. That way, we can see its consistency to whether accurate ba ang iyang i-provide. No? Mauna, dili gyud ta dapat mo judge or mo provide ayon sa ato ang opinion when we are being presented with an artifact or material. Say for example, no, a very good speech from former President Marcos Sr., no, talking about something about the growth and development of Pilipinas. But it only highlights some part, no, of his speeches. Dili itong entire speech niya na amidst these successes na nahitabo sa iyang time na po yung mga problems na na-meet ang government. No? And then we just put forth our trust, our decisions. No? It's because natin nakita ang maayong gisulti. And we have not checked the totality of his presidency for 20 years. So muna yan po ang dapat naunahon. No? We should not be biased on our judgment. Let us check and counter-check other sources. That's the only way where we can provide internal criticism. Muna, dili po nato ma-blame, no? Ang ato ang mga kaila siguro na dili parehas sa ato og knowledge with regards to how to identify properly sources of information because they have not been able to engage discussions like this. And this engagement is very academic by nature, no? And if you say something to a person close to you, nga dapat mo check by, no, asa man ka ng source ana. Sa TikTok ra man na kinsa man nang sulti ana. Tinuod ba gyud ang gisulti sa may sources niya sa iyang ipangsulti. No, di man makasabot ang atong ipang istorya na musulti na dayon sa ato nga kay eskwela gani ka, hilas na kayo ka, no? I hope wala pud mo nakaging mga ngana, no, but there are people who would really make that opinion or probably judgment to you. It's because probably they're not open also, no, to criticism. So that's the hazard. But I'm not saying na i-invalidate na to ang ilahang judgment lang, decision on how they check the sources, no? Because it's not their fault man sad. At some point, no, it's the platform's capability to filter the correct information from the incorrect ones. It's the policies that the government should be focusing on to mitigate problems with misinformation, disinformation, with fake news, no? And even the idea ng cancel culture, that should be taken into consideration. So that kind of factors nga nakamotivate sa katao to really put his opinion about that. But for us who are in the academics, no, especially for the students who are studying readings in Philippine history, this is how we put emphasis on critical thinking. Okay? Highlight na na critical thinking. So from this day forth, no, anything that you check online, you have to make cross-references. And before you say something as an opinion, even that is your opinion and you are entitled with the rights, constitutional rights and freedom of speech and expression, that doesn't mean you become irresponsible to your posts. Because you have your teachers na friends nimo sa Facebook or katong mga kailan nimo academically, no, inclined sila. And of course, kay friend man mo sa Facebook, baka or sa Twitter, sometimes they may find a way to comment because they wanted to share also what they know. No? And that starts the engagement. It could lead to very fruitful na engagement or sometimes mahimo nang offensive to both parties because dili mo dawat ang usa-usa. No? Para malikayan, imong opinion, but ang iyong basihan. No? Pero mas maayo para wala ka comment ang mga tao, katong mga positive na mga post ang ibang butang mo, mga godly na mga post baka mga inspirational message, no? Permanente makomentahan is mga political na aspect sa ato ang post, probably entertainment nga aspect sa post, no? Kung nakichismis, may permanente based on data nga kung ipang basa, no? Muna yung mga permanente common nga na ay aggressive na mga comments. It's because lahi-lahi mag-political inclination ng mga tao. Lahi-lahi og mga support system nakabase sa ilahang mga ipang-idolize na mga artista. Okay? Or utang, no? Or kanang sa pana kabit-kabit, may kasagaran nato makita, no, sa Facebook or sa any social media platform na makakause og intrigue till such time nag-cancel na no nagkinansilay na sa usa-usa. Okay? So avoid those kind of things because again, you are in college now, no? You're considered to be mga kolehiyala at may tawag sa lalaki. Basta kayo na mo sa stage that you are giving more emphasis on critical thinking. Okay? Sige. So, you understood now what is the value of external and internal criticism. Nakuha ba? Type 1 if nakuha. Okay, sige. Great, no, great. Moving on. Let's talk about reliability, no? So, reliability refers to how consistently a method measures something. If the same result can be consistently achieved by using the same methods under the same circumstances, the measurement is considered reliable. Mabita lang if you will conduct, no, a surveying a research and then you propose or you created a survey material. Since wala man ka nag-adapt, kay kanang ipang-adapt na itong survey material, it undergone naman reliability test, no? So meaning to say, valid and accurate na siya. Pero kung mag-craft ka from scratch, inuha yun na, then you must conduct reliability test, no? Probably, maghatag ka o series of tests sa kanang section 1 and section 2, no? Bali duha ka simana ka mag-conduct sa first week o sa second week o sa napod-test. And then you check, of course, na siya yung statistical treatment yapon, no, to check the reliability results of each question, no, from that particular na variable. Pag makita nimo na the same or within the parameters, no, ang result, then that is reliable. It is accepted by the academic world na saktong imong gibuhat, no, following the process ng science, then that can be reliable. Now, why we need to have a reliable na source? Because we cannot afford to fake or invent, no, or to forge an important part ng history. No, if you're conducting historical research, dili pwede nga nagbuhat-buhat lang tao, nagtugma-tugma lang ta. Say for example, no, because he wanted to gather the data as soon as possible. Tapos nag-conduct ka of surveying research sa imuhang mga estudyante, kuhon, butang na to. Na ay mga estudyante dito nga nag-answer na wala. Then you wanted to have a balanced number from your respondents. Dapat section 1, 15 kabuok, no, based sa inyong gibuhat nga random sampling, 15 kabuok yung ipili sa second section, third, fourth, 15 sila. No, and then ang ni answer lang yun sa 15, kaya ang A, B, and C nga section lang. And D o E is wala kayo sila nagpakabana, anak. And because you wanted to have a balanced level, ikaw na nag-answer. That causes problem to your research. Because it's not truthful anymore, you can't really tell whether ang imo bang conduct na research sakto ba. No? Because you already have an assumption na dapat mo ni pa-answer nila. imo man ang assumption, dili mo parehas sa experience. Your students might have different perception, experience, background, no? In answering the questions that you have. So kung ikaw lang nagbugna sa kaugalingon kay just to make sure na balance ang number or representation, no, per section, then mali na siya daan. And that is fraudulent na pagbuhat sa research. Okay? So always remember that. So what is contradictory sources? Now, contradiction is the ability to compare two separate sources and find information that differs between them. So contradiction is when the things said by two sources cannot both be true. One has to be wrong. No? So may contradiction. And that is accepted when we write historical research. No, not everything that is positive ng ibang ibutang dito. No, dapat napoy contradicting na literature or study ang imong ibutang dito just to give balance ba with your claim, no? Kay mahitabo mo if everything is falling in place ba na mga correct na information lang imong ipabutang dito or ba correct literature na uyon sa imong study, then we cannot see the other side, no? Now pwedeng exist na mga researches or literature na mo contradict sa imong claim. It is up to you to prove, no, whether true ba or false ang imong gibuhat sa imong research. Mo na nakalindot sa contradictory sources, no? Even sa imong survey instrument, dapat dili positive tanan ang imong gipangsulat dito sa imong item. So dapat na apoy negative just to make sure that your students are following, no? And also just to give the pulse ba na makita po nila na dili ra po tanan, no, on the positive side. Apoy yung mga negative side niya pwede nila na-experience or wala, no? No need actually to introduce what is an eyewitness. No, it is you who actually witnessed a specific event, and that is you will be considered as a primary source. So, dito na ta sa identification of historical importance of text. No? Now, the following are concepts to be considered in the identification of historical importance of text. What are texts? No, these are materials written. No? The books, journals, mga magazines, newspaper. So, these are texts. No? Let's talk about analytical concepts. So, the nature of the primary sources requires researchers to engage with them analytically. Mabito lang sa research na to na ay analysis, no? Because we need to analyze the data that we tested and the result of that test. So, users active primary sources through hypothesis, no? Analysis, synthesis, interpretation, critical thinking, and evaluation. They use sources to develop both questions and arguments. Primary source analysis requires the interrogation of materiality, historical context, and narrative. Users need to understand how sources were produced and delivered. Interpretation of sources occurs on the continuum from the creation of the source to its utilization by the current user, and includes mediation by librarians, archivists, and database creators or designers. Self-reflective users consider primary sources in the context of their own projects as well as their agency in creating new primary sources. So we need to carefully analyze data that we have gathered and tested. Next, same thing, no? Ethical concepts. When we write research, dapat ng ethical consideration. Dili ta magpataka o buhat og research na unethical siya. Mabito nang sa mga eskwelahan, in PNU for example, natay ethical board review, no? But before you proceed conducting your research, no? Pagpasa pa lang daan nimo sa imong concept paper, when you write your concept paper, kung may concept sa akong research, doon na mo dito ang ethical standard. What are the do's and don'ts sa pag-conduct sa imong research? That way, we can avoid problems, no? In the near future, especially that you are aiming to publish your work. All right? Next, we have theoretical concepts. These concepts such as evidence, authority, power, authenticity, context, materiality, historical empathy, agency, value, absences, and privilege underpin the collection, arrangement, and presentation of primary sources. Collections in cultural heritage institutions reflect and reinforce societal power structures. Users must seek to understand resulting silences and absences. by critically considering what sources were never created, what sources may no longer exist, and what sources are collected, as well as communities' abilities to engage in these activities. Now, the iterative nature of research and the interplay between primary and secondary sources must also be considered throughout the research and production process as users seek to contextualize and understand their sources. So collections and databases are always mediated in some way, and exhibits digital collections and guides or other access tools reflect the selection, reproduction, and presentation decisions of many individuals, decisions that may not be self-evident. So theory or theoretical concepts. No? When we write research, yani importante ang theory because we have to anchor our research to a certain degree of theory. No? Our theory that we must follow should answer whether true or not ang imuhang gitest. Okay? And not just one theory. At least you have sub-theories to fulfill support to your claim, whether we reject the hypothesis or we accept the hypothesis. Nga na siya ka-importante. Mabita nang when you look at mga quantitative na mga researches, pag tanaw nimo sa iyahang conceptual theoretical framework, makita nimo dito asa naka-anchor na siya na theory. No? Mga most common nga theories sa education, mo na yung makita diha. Okay? Next, we have practical considerations. So there are practical considerations particular to using primary sources that users should be aware of. Practical skills necessary for primary source research include finding, accessing, gathering, and handling primary sources in a variety of formats and locations, especially handling. No? If you are to present an important artifact from the past, you need to know how to handle this artifact. If you have seen videos from paleontologists discovering mga fossils ng mga dinosaurs or other remains from the past, they are carefully handling it, from trying to unfold what is being buried, in earth for several million years ago, right? So they're carefully getting, the dili na muna siya pure bones, actually wala na siya bones, nahimo na siyang mineral. Throughout that time, kanang atong nakita ng mga fossil material, dili na sila bone, but instead, mga minerals na sila, composed of several minerals from the soil, So, kaya para din na siya mabungkag, para buo lang gihapon na makita niya, then they have to carefully dig and airbrush and then try to put plasters, just to get out it from the soil, and then airbrush again, trying just to get the dirt para makita lang gid nato ang finished product. So that's how important to know practical skills on handling materials. Or if these are paper, from the time of Jose Rizal, ang iyahang nolamitan nga rin ang original na book, and yung filibusterismo, they are not being cleaned normally. Because the paper material being used, the pen, the ink being used, niya, grabe ka delicate na kayo. Lisod kayo na kinluan ang mga old na books. It's because it may tarnish in one single mistake. So grabe kayo ka-detailed ang ilang pagbuhat and it needed amount of money because of the materials na kinahanglan. Okay? Now, in order to reach their goals, users should understand what is and is not accessible in specific institutions or databases. This is for privacy. There are information that is not available online or even in libraries or in any archives. It's because it holds an important information that is not available for public consumption. Especially mga information that involves national and international na mga discussions from the government. Dili din sila nimo makita sa mga government websites. That will be kept as secret. It's because those are private na mga materials. Right? They will need to be aware on how these sources are described in familiar search tools. So, of course, dapat you're familiar when you wanted to access mga related studies, you're familiar with websites who holds an ample amount of researches in various places or all over the world. If you're familiar with JSTOR, EBSCO, host, no, or ProQuest, JSTOR again, mga archives coming from Harvard School, Cambridge. So these are mga websites, legitimate websites that holds legitimate put the mga researches being published from referred journals, no, or books being published in mga renowned publishing company. Meaning to say, anong dapat peer-reviewed man ang ato ang mga researches. This is where we can attest, no, the validity of your claim. Mabitaw ng, di ba, nag-present man siguro mo sa iyong research katong high school mo, na mo sa senior high, na may panelist, no? That is where we get a nod to whether your claim is accepted by the academic world. Because the academic world know how to follow science. Pwede lang mo magbot-bot of research na to without even following anything. Di ba? And we claim. The problem is, kana ba yung claim objectively done or subjectively done ba na? Muna siyang pinakatakong question. Where did you get your data? How did you get your data? No? Also may mga evidences that prove that your data is correct. How, what is your anchor theory? So dagan kayong mga pangutana, and if you can't answer that one, then what you are doing is completely wrong, or actually not accepted, no, in the practice academically. Okay. Okay, so I think that's the end of our discussion, no? So I hope you have learned an ample amount of information from what is being presented today as part of the reinforcement ng discussion natin ng Module 2. So these are primary sources, secondary sources, and even tertiary sources. We talk about external and internal criticism, reliability, and even validity, no? Talk about a little bit of that. We also talk about mga ethical concepts, no? The importance of text, by the way. Okay? Let me stop presenting. And I'd like to see some hands, no, for clarifications if there are, or anything that you'd like to ask about or share in our class, or nakasabot ba ang tanan? Nakuha ba ang ato ang discussion?
Yes, sir.
Susun? Nasabdan na lang. Okay. I hope, no? Nasabdan yun. Okay, so very basic naman sa doon. Kasi pag siguro natin discuss, as long as you read and research, no? Makasabot din mo. Anyways, again, tomorrow will be the deadline of your Module 2. And probably tomorrow, Thursday, I'll be sending you the Module 3. Okay? If there's no question, I'll be ending our session. And I'll be seeing you next online sync. Okay? Claro?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So,
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
goodbye, update 1-1. See you next meeting. Have a great day.
Thank you,
Bye,
sir.
sir.
Bye.
Bye, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Matira matibay. Good afternoon, everyone. Napa mo?